thought rather than trying to get into all of them, because I get so confused as to what happened to whom, we talk a little bit actually about politics. And this is what we were talking about. Speaker Pelosi for a long time was reluctant to get into the impeachment inquiry because I think she felt that until there was a broader political consensus, it might have been futile. And of course, the whistleblower and the specific incidents of the call to the Ukrainian president focused her and I think everybody else, and now we're moving forward. But it does beg the question, given that right now we're not seeing very many folks line up in the Republican Party, are we engaged in sort of an exercise in futility if this goes through the House and then ends up not making it into trial in the Senate?
Get the hard stuff out of the way
and we're going to
first, then we'll get the easy stuff like Middle East and China. Well, Jack, thank you, and thanks to the World Affairs Forum. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. On TV, you speak in 20, 30-second blocks, and on the House floor, you get a minute or 2 minutes, and then the gavel comes down, and obviously the topics that we're interested in require and demand a lot more time than that, so I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have a more thoughtful discussion. So yeah, let me try to put into perspective where we are. At some level, yeah, impeachment is a futile exercise in the sense that there is, I think, no circumstance under which the Senate would convict the president, and as a consequence, you can sort of play this out. There's likely to be an impeachment vote on the floor, it's likely to pass, and then it's not going to go any further. So why do it? There is a story being told out there that the Democrats are doing this because they believe they can't beat Donald Trump in an election. I think that's a wrong-headed story, because I actually don't think that impeachment is particularly helpful to the Democrats' objective of winning in 2020. And in fact, when I came out in favor of an impeachment inquiry in June, I did it knowing that it was probably counterproductive to what I, as a Democrat, hope happens in 2020. And I think that's still true. Remember, the presidential election is going to come down really to 3 states. It's going to come down to Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Maybe North Carolina, maybe Florida, but you win Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, it's game over. And those are places that are very different from where we are sitting here today, and in which, and I should be careful about trying to channel what people are thinking in Zanesville, Ohio, or small towns in Michigan, but my colleagues who come from that place say, look, this, people are focused on how they're going to educate their kids and their retirement security and health care, and the more you guys talk about impeachment, or, and this is controversial, the border, or XYZ that we're talking a lot about, the less people feel like you're looking after their interests. So I actually think it may be counterproductive to 2020. But, and this is the but, and this is where I come from, and I understand it'll come off as partisan, I suppose, but at some point, your obligation to the Constitution and your obligation to history and your obligation to historical precedent requires that you meet what I consider to be behavior way beyond the pale with the most forceful remedy. Now, there will be people in the room, and there's certainly people in the country who say, oh, the behavior's not that bad. And this is not the forum in which to litigate the behavior, but there's sort of 3 categories of things. There's volume 1 and volume 2 of the Mueller report. Volume 1 is not criminal conspiracy, but some pretty ugly behavior with respect to meddling in an election. Volume 2 is firing Jim Comey to try to end the investigation, ordering people to go tell the Attorney General to stop an investigation. That's bad stuff, arguably impeachable. Then there's the fact that the president is ignoring congressional subpoenas, etc. That's impeachable. But those 2 things are not things that are easily grasped by the American public on average, right? Obstruction of justice and refusal to comply with lawful process. These are not things that sort of, shake people's timbers. What we see now, where, and again, the fact pattern is largely out there, but where, aid may have been stopped in favor of a, request for a political investigation, that's something that you can almost hear the strains of The Godfather playing in the background, right? People get that. And so I think that's one of the reasons that was the last thing, and it was the most understandable thing. So I think Nancy Pelosi, knowing that it probably wasn't politically helpful, said, okay, this is understandable. It's the third thing. we've got to go.
So you would imagine then that the articles of impeachment themselves will be pretty narrow. I mean, there is this discussion about should we keep it to this conversation in Ukraine and encouraging dirt on a political opponent, or should we bring in all of those other issues like obstruction of justice and the Mueller report and so forth? Where do you come down on how wide or narrow those articles will be?
Well, remember the House will vote on articles individually. This is the way impeachment happens. So I have a bias towards saying, put the articles out there that are legitimate, that have some substantiation to them, and let people vote. What has happened and what's transpiring now is I think pretty ugly and pretty understandable. But look, the President of the United States doesn't get to say no to a congressional subpoena. We are a co-equal branch of power. And I can tell my Republican colleagues this, there will be a Democratic president someday, and in that moment, you are really going to want the executive to observe what has always been observed. And presidents always drag their heels on subpoenas and stuff, but they never say no. And so my own bias would be, if it's legitimate and substantiated, put it out there and let people vote on it.
All right, enough on impeachment.
Thank you.
Well, I'm sure we'll get a few questions, I would imagine, but we'll move on. And maybe we can start. I mean, there's so many different parts of the world to ask you about. You've just come back. Congressman was telling me you just came back yesterday or the day before from Pakistan. So I'd be interested in hearing what you did there. But before getting into kind of individual hotspots, I thought maybe we could have a quick conversation about some broader trends that seem to be affecting so much of what's going on politically as well as foreign policy. And one of the things you mentioned to me before coming up was, well, for all of the partisanship that we're going through right now, you can understand what's driving, actually, sometimes President Trump and his policies, and certainly what's behind so many of his supporters, that the globalization that we've seen and digitization that we've seen drive our economies across the world have left an awful lot of people behind. And it's not just true in the United States. The same trends are happening in Europe and in Brazil and many other places around the world. Talk to us a little bit about how you see all of that shaking out. I was saying I was worried that this is like a period, and Ray Dalio, if you know Ray Dalio, Bridgewater, wrote an article this week, which is interesting because he talks about the parallel between 1930 and 1935 and what's happening today in so many ways. Talk to us about where you think this is coming from, some of the political, some of these issues that we're grappling right now, populism and so forth, and where it might take us.
Yeah. I mean, let me start with something that, having been a little hard on the president in the previous 5 minutes, the president's instincts, the principles from which he is coming are recognizable, and dare I say, legitimate. The president believes that the United States has gotten a raw deal. He points out repeatedly that our NATO allies have never, most of them have never complied with the requirement that 2% of GDP get spent on defense. It is true that China has been predatory with respect to trade. And so he comes from a place that is, actually a legitimate tradition. It's not globalist, but it's a legitimate place to come from. He's not wrong about those things. In my view, the way he goes about trying to change that is a catastrophe. Just take the China thing. He's not wrong. China's been stealing our IP. They've been predatory. They haven't done it lately, but they manipulate their currency to deindustrialize the United States. That's all true. But two things. Number one, it's rarely a good idea with I think of China as a little bit of a frenemy, right? I mean, we have profound shared interests with the Chinese to make them the enemy and to seek to somehow win the way the president conceives of it. And oh, by the way, it's a terrible idea to think that you're going to be able to force the other side to absorb more political pain through tariffs than you can absorb. This is an autocracy that controls the media and, lived through historical catastrophes that none of us can imagine. We're a democracy where people complain 24/7, and so the idea that we're going to turn up tariffs, and they're going to turn up countervailing tariffs, and they're going to be the first party to say uncle is crazy. They're just not going to do that. And by the way, the culture is one of not capitulating. I don't fully understand, Asian cultures of saving face, but the tactic is one that is overly confrontational and not likely to work. And so, yeah, inside where the president is coming from is not an illegitimate point of view. And to your final point, we would do well to reflect on what he's tapped into. That has domestic political implications if you don't like where we are, but it also explains what's happening around the world, right? We're not the only country to have an illiberal populist running the show. Hungary, Poland, Philippines, Brazil, I could go on. Something's happening there, and it's pretty clear what's happening. Globalization has a backlash. We are in a backlash against, call it, we're in a World Affairs Forum, the Washington Consensus. Quite frankly, something that I bought into, hook, line, and sinker, which is that globalization is a uniformly good thing. It will bring the world into the 21st century. It will make people wealthier. It will spread democracy. Well, yes, on average, and let's say this right up front, trade and the spread of market capitalism and globalization has been the single thing in the last 3 generations that has lifted the most people, billions, out of poverty in places like Asia and Korea and China and Latin America and to a lesser extent in Africa. So yes, that's true, but it also has devastated communities, particularly in the old industrial economies, back to Michigan. On average, there's no question that globalization has been a good thing, but it's like that old adage, right? Don't ever try to walk across a river that is on average 6 feet deep, right? People have been devastated, including our own industrial communities. And so now you have economic angst, and you have something which is a little darker, which is, in conservative communities, whether they're in Poland or Hungary or in Zanesville, Ohio, you've got a lot more immigrants. All of a sudden, people are speaking different languages and subscribing to more exotic religions. That can pretty easily be turned into, hey, they're not like you. And then you get what you see in places like Poland and Hungary and Brazil, which is a real reaction. And we can pull our hair out over that, but we better take it seriously. We better take it seriously because it's not. It drives me crazy when Democrats, say these Trump people, they're stupid. No, they're not stupid. They're coming from a place that is legitimate. And if you want to really address it, you better grapple with that place that they're coming from, which means grappling with what happens when societies change pretty quickly.
You mentioned China, so I'll start there. I had it starting someplace else, but since you put it on the map there, and their predatory behavior. You are chairman of the Subcommittee on Advanced Research, and I saw you wrote an article recently about the Chinese and about the advancements that they're making, and about your concern that the United States is really losing leadership, or at least is at risk of losing leadership in R&D because of not making the kind of investments that they are, things like AI. What should we be doing about it that we're not?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it up because we worry about a lot of stuff, and to some extent people aren't very good at being smart about risk. That's true of us as a species, right? We all fear flying. Flying's not going to kill you. You don't fear the double bacon cheeseburger that is going to kill you. But flying, so we evaluate risk very, very badly, and we do this in national security. And one of the risks that we wildly underappreciate is what happens if we lose our innovative edge, in particular to the Chinese. And I'm not picking on the Chinese. They've just made remarkable advancements. I mean, they've gone from an economy that made cheap stuff 30 years ago to an economy that is actually competing with us on things like artificial intelligence and quantum computing and you name it. And 2 things need to happen. One, we need to keep up. And so if we're really serious about national security, we better start talking about STEM education in our yeah, we're going to have good surveillance, we're going to have a good military and everything else. But By the way, I'm saying something that Admiral Bill McRaven said 2 weeks ago at a Council on Foreign Relations thing. If you haven't seen it, the Council on Foreign Relations did a big report on innovation and national security. It was chaired by Bill McRaven. Anybody who doesn't know McRaven and wants to know about his bona fides, he's the admiral who commanded SEAL Team 6 when they took out UBL in Abbottabad. So this guy's got some pretty serious national security cred, and he says if you're really serious about this, you're going to make sure that your young people have the skills to be innovators to keep up. So number one, we need to keep up, and we're at a point now where the Chinese, depending on what we're talking about, we're pretty much neck and neck on technology and innovation. We're going to keep up, and then hopefully, and this is something we should talk a little bit more about, hopefully we're not going to fall into the trap of thinking that it's a zero-sum game, that we're only at odds with the Chinese, because things like artificial intelligence, things like the Internet of everything being wired, we need to be in partnership with them to protect things like the fact that everything is wired, to come to an agreement around what we'll do about some of the really scary artificial intelligence technologies. How are we going to think about biosynthesis, right? The Chinese are already getting into some pretty uncomfortable places, and we now live in a world where you can just in a laboratory create a whole new organism. Well, we better put this together a sort of set of ethics and norms around that, and that's going to require us to cooperate with them and not just think of ourselves as antagonists.
Right. What is happening? I mean, I read that in your article. What is happening now, though, in terms of trying to create the forum or whatever to do that?
Well,
is there anything going on that we should know about? Because it's so important, obviously, to have international norms, and you don't read much about it.
yeah, I think we're way behind where we need to be. My sense is that academia is where a lot of this stuff around biosynthesis and AI, artificial intelligence, is. My sense is that academia is doing some thinking about this. They're sort of looking at the technologies and saying, oh my God. It's a little bit like 1945 when scientists were coming to understand what nuclear technology could be, but more so. So my sense is that academia is doing a little bit of that thinking, but we're nowhere. I mean, we can't, everybody here has been in one way or another a victim of a cyber attack. It might have been through whatever, Walmart or something, but we can't even get, through the United Nations Global Council of Experts, or whatever they're called, we can't even get some agreements on that. And it shouldn't be that hard, right? I mean, we can all agree, whether you're Iran or North Korea or the United States, we ought to all agree that we're not going to shut down each other's hospitals, right? I mean, start there. And then it gets more complicated, but we're not even having that conversation. I think that's a huge problem.
Yeah. Let's move on to another part of the world, Middle East and sort of the war on terrorism. Just come back from Pakistan, which I'd love to hear more about. I thought I posed the question though a little bit around how we talked earlier about where President Trump might be coming from, and an area of agreement in some respects is that a nervousness about foreign entanglements has been something that you've been concerned about too, that we've got a bad history sometimes of moving into areas that we shouldn't have. And Afghanistan is sort of one of them. He's wanted, you've written that you want to reduce our presence in Afghanistan. He trying to do the same thing. We had the negotiations with the Taliban that seemed to be walked right up to the moment of signing the Camp David and then fell apart. And then I guess this week I read that they may have started up again, those negotiations. Where are we going? First, where are we going in Afghanistan? Where should we go? What should our policy be? And then, because it's so related, what about Pakistan? What did you learn over there?
Big topic. We have an uncomfortable nostalgia, not quite the right word, but we have an uncomfortable nostalgia for Afghanistan for obvious reasons, right? This is where the attack of 9/11 originated and was supported. And so I'm not saying it's not understandable, but Afghanistan is far from the only ungoverned space on the planet. There's ungoverned space in Syria, in Yemen, in Somalia, in parts of Morocco, and all over the world. There is ungoverned space. And so saying we're going to dump billions and billions of dollars into this ungoverned space and lose, serviceman or woman every 2 or 3 weeks, whatever it is now. It begs the question of, yeah, but what about Yemen and Syria and Somalia and all the other ungoverned? It's not a model that works. And so it feels to me, easy for me to say because I'm not in the room, but it feels to me that there's a pretty clear deal to be struck, and I think it was struck actually with the Taliban, which is, all right, we're on our way out. You need to make sure you don't ever do what you did back in 2001, which is create the space for Al-Qaeda or other groups to launch international attacks. That's a deal that I think we can and should do. That will allow us to reduce our footprint there pretty dramatically. It will finally be the end of the notion that we can reinvent Afghanistan's culture and society, which was always a terrible idea. And I don't say that with great happiness, because one objection to that point of view, which is a very fair objection, is, are we really going to leave Afghanistan's women to the tender mercies of the Taliban? And that's a very fair question. But, you know, again, maybe I just take a more cynical view of how we should use our blood and treasure. I think we should continue to push on all illiberal regimes for human rights and women's rights and everything else. I'm just not sure we want to spend the kind of money and lives that we're spending on that in order to address all of our challenges in Afghanistan. So I think, back to the ungoverned space, 2 things, just to oversimplify. Our military and our intelligence community is extraordinary at finding and ending terrorists. I see this every single day, and they're absolutely extraordinary. The surveillance, the capabilities, and yes, this comes with a cost. There is, as the military says, collateral damage to the kind of lethal activities that our counterterrorism effort involves. So it's not free, but they're very, very good at it. I think if we told anybody in this room on September 12th, 2001, that we would go, 18 years without another major international terrorist attack on our soil, you wouldn't have believed it. And that's largely due to the incredible capabilities of our military and intelligence community. So we keep that up because they're very, very good at it. And then we start talking about the underlying causes. Why do people get drawn to extremist ideologies? Go to Peshawar. I was just in Peshawar. I saw it from behind bulletproof glass. But let me be direct. It's hell on earth. If you're a child, if you're a young man in Peshawar, you've got 0 opportunity. And this is true all over the world. And until we get serious about making sure that young people have opportunities, that they have some way to express. I'm not even calling for democracies around the world. Let's not do that. But let's just governments that are somewhat responsive to the demands of young people. And I'm talking about Egypt, I'm talking about Saudi Arabia, I'm talking about an awful lot of countries here, somewhat responsive to the political demands of people, somewhat responsive to people's desire to actually earn a living wage. People are going to be attracted to extremism. So again, I'm all for the counterterrorism that we do, but we don't want to do it forever. And the way not to do it forever is to, in a very careful, not military way, but in a very careful way, urge the kind of development that will get people interested in prosperity and in liberalizing their political system rather than joining ISIS or Al-Qaeda or you name it.
And I think, that's what's, just listening to you, that's what's so difficult about it. We were talking about, I was in Peshawar and did the Khyber Pass on a trip years ago for UNHCR when the Taliban was in power. They had control of most of Afghanistan. And you do, I feel very much conflicted because if we do withdraw our presence, the likelihood, I think most people's estimate is that the Taliban will probably take back control. They already control a good part of the country. And then you leave space that's fertile for the eventual, Al-Qaeda's and ISIS's of the world, and that's going to be a hard trade-off. But let's move on. Because I have so many different things to go through, and I think I have maybe one more question before we go to all of you in the audience. So I thought I'd do it with, and I've got just a number of hotspots here, but I just picked one that's a little closer to home, and we were talking about it too, that doesn't seem, and your background in Latin America, and it doesn't get the kind of attention here that I think it deserves, and that's Venezuela. And the absolute tragedy that's going on there, more than 9,000 people, executed, 4 million have been forced from their homes. You told me you were on the border, the Colombian border. I saw that. What's going to be done about Maduro? How long do we just let this go until he absolutely collapses, which we thought would happen a long time ago and is not? What should be our policy?
Yeah, it's a great question. My anti-interventionist Latin American cred is as good as it gets, right? I grew up first 10 years of my life there. I have a profound understanding of, starting in 1900, the interferences and Sandino and you name it, and Allende, and I mean, I promise you, my anti-interventionist credibility is about as good as it gets. But I stood there on the border of Venezuela looking in, and I almost couldn't help it. I thought, oh my God, we got to do something more, And of course, that's not the right answer in terms of, we shouldn't be landing troops in Maracaibo, but it's, like so many things in foreign policy. It's hard for Americans. This is one of the real challenges. We look for the good answer, the right answer, right? Almost none of these problems have good and right answers. So you end up with an answer that is, it's a little bit like what happens when you do a deal with the Taliban. It's not a good answer. You're left with the need to work with all of the other countries that are there, and we've been pretty good at that. I give the president credit for being pretty good about working with the other countries in the Americas. Ratchet up the pressure. I agree with the sanctions. The sanctions, of course, are causing an awful lot of harm, as sanctions do to people who are not complicit in the regime. But I think we just need to keep the pressure up. There'll be an interesting book written. There was a moment when Maduro was on his way to the airport, and the president of the assembly, Guaido, it looked like this was a tipping point, and there might have been, having already established my anti-interventionist credibility, there might have been in that moment an opportunity, again, not with troops, not landing Marines anywhere, but to really push that one over.
You might have heard about this when you were on the House Committee on Intelligence. But
Yeah.
Other things that were happening.
So there might have been a moment, but how you know that at the time, it's in retrospect that you know that might have been a moment where a little bit of a push might have made the difference. But again, like everybody in this room, I want the right and good answer, and we're just going to have to sort of keep squeezing Venezuela until we see a change there.
So we keep sanctions on and keep supporting Guaido, even though he seems to be losing
Yeah.
popular support.
I mean,
One of the
real challenges, again, this will be familiar to people who follow foreign policy. I'm an optimist about look, I understand United Fruit, I understand all the unseemly stuff, overthrew a few democratically elected governments in Chile and Iran and elsewhere, but I really am an optimist about our foreign policy, but some of these things take time.
Yeah. All right. Let's open it up to all of you for...
Actually, hello. Sorry, I was just going to give you one more question, because I know that we took a little bit of your time away at the beginning. So if you have one more question, we'll...
No.
Okay.
If I do, I'll jump in with... I'll reserve my right to one more question at some point.
So who's got a question? Okay.
Is there a political solution to Kashmir?
My instinct on things like Kashmir are that we have to sort of fall back on the principle of self-determination. I think the Kashmiris ought to have the main vote on what their political future is. And there's been, and I'm not super expert on the 70-year history here. It's annoying because both the Pakistanis in particular are using it as a distraction away from some of the challenges that they have in Pakistan. I think to a lesser extent, the Indians are doing that as well. It's pretty clear that the Prime Minister is doing this for that whole BJP, Hindu nationalist, why should they be special up there take on things. So again, I'm not sure I know the answer, but I would certainly back the notion that there ought to, at great long last, perhaps be a plebiscite in which the people of Kashmir make their own determination, with Pakistan and India agreeing to respect whatever outcome the people there want.
So
Leslie, and I thank you too for coming here today. And Congressman, I give you credit for being on the nation this morning again. So prior to the argument that Iranian hackers, so we're trying to target a U.S. campaign for next year's election, and that Trump has previously was threatening Ukraine to investigate Biden as they're trying to make his way to get to get into the White House again for next year's election by foreigners as 2016 threatened our nation. Would you take a serious action or seriously by making sure that those targets of those hackers who are trying to target next year's elections, those who are running for president, and how to keep our country in a safe environment so that our voice was not to have the voting rights being heard, so that we can take more things more seriously and to punish those who try to threaten our nation.
Yeah. One of the disappointing things about since 2016 is it's not hard to mess in our election. It's actually technically hard, and I'm glad I have the opportunity to say this. It's actually technically hard to mess around with our elections. There were a lot of people that were worried that vote counts were compromised, that the Russians were inside registrars of voter systems, and they made a real attempt to do it. But the truth is, the technical part of this is actually pretty hard to do. We have a very fragmented system. It's really pretty hard to do, and data scientists can look at results and say there's an anomaly here. So while we have more to do in securing our technology, we're in reasonably good shape there. What is not hard, of course, is using our free and open media environment to influence the way people think about this stuff. And if you go and you look at the Twitter ads that the Russians bought or the Facebook ads, and you just realize they were very sophisticated at getting us hyped up, and they exploited racial divisions and religious divisions and gender divisions, you name it. And I'm not sure that we as American citizens have done enough to understand that we got to take a very critical look at how we absorb information, and do we open ourselves up to the other side, and just because something feels good to read on Facebook am I maybe being manipulated? So I continue to really worry about that, and I promise you the Russians, and by the way the Iranians and the Chinese and who the heck else knows, they're going to get in on the action this time. So again, I think technologically we're in a relatively good place, but I think we have a national conversation to be had about, particularly at this moment of very heightened political passions, where everything is very tribal and maybe facts are not quite as important as one would hope they would be, to really reflect on our need to be critical consumers of information and therefore good citizens of a democracy.
Back to your first area of discussion on globalization. If you agree that globalization is here to stay and we're not going to reverse it, and there are a lot of positive outcomes of globalization, what do you think or will be done to mitigate the negative outcomes? How it has hurt a lot of people in our country and worldwide, and which results in the negative views of globalization.
A lot, the horse has largely left the barn on that. Just to set up a little bit of a cartoon, if you were a small-scale Mexican corn grower growing corn on 2 acres, or if you were bending metal in a whirlpool plant in Michigan, the damage is done. And the damage was terrible. And we live in a world of largely free markets. I mean, even the trade agreements that we're talking about now are talking about reducing tariffs 7, 8%, whatever. They're sort of on the margin. And so, in terms of what the economists call dislocation, which is a way of saying there's vast swaths of the middle class in the Midwest who are no longer middle class, and they're angry, rightly so. A lot of that damage has been done. And yes, we're not putting that horse back in the barn. We're not building walls around our countries anymore. And there's a whole other factor too. which is automation. Oftentimes the opponents of trade, and when I say the opponents of trade, I mean people who are very conscious of the devastation that was caused by the opening of borders, underappreciate the way automation has radically changed the economy. Everything from when was the last time you were in a travel agency to guys like me, politicians, elected officials, we're a little dishonest, right? More manufacturing, more manufacturing. You've been on a modern manufacturing floor anytime recently? There are very few people there on a modern manufacturing floor. So the combination of globalization plus automation has really, really hurt a lot of people. So your question was, what can we do about that? Number one, recognize that the horse is largely out of the barn. Maybe two things. And one comes, we already said before, which is, it's back to Bill McRaven, right? Let's really get serious about educating our young people for the jobs that are out there. Because those are, the nice thing about automation and stuff, there's more jobs. There are more jobs. But those are very high-end jobs, right? There are jobs that are in strategy and marketing and in programming. And we really need to make a national effort to make sure our kids are going to have the opportunity to have those high-end jobs. And we do a terrible job at that. The other thing we do, well, in some places we do a terrible job at that. The other thing we don't do nearly as good enough job at is cushioning the fall for people who are either technologically or because of trade or globalization left high and dry. We've got these programs, trade adjustment assistance, and they're just terrible. You know, the best outcome there is that guy who used to work at the Whirlpool is now getting, you know, $800 a month maybe from some federal bureaucracy and stuff. And we really need to think much more seriously, including, and I sort of hesitate to go here because this is a conversation for 10 years from now, including things like, you know, wage insurance. I wouldn't even take off, I think it's 20 years too soon, but a universal basic income. Look, if we live in a world where programmers are making 90% of the income and we're all benefiting through this stuff, you know, we are going to need to find ways to make sure that if all of the money is in a very small number of professions, that more people, you know, who maybe don't have the skills to be in that thing are kept at some minimum level of prosperity. Now, you know, that points to universal basic income, which I understand it's an idea whose time hasn't come. But given where the economy is going, it better be on the table for where we appear to be going in the future.
So while we're passing the microphone, there's a great, just finished book by Paul Collier, The Future of Capitalism. I don't know if any of you have read it. If you haven't, to answer your question, it's a good one to read because he's very prescriptive about some of these solutions. He's a really well-respected economist, British economist, but he goes into some of those same kinds of tax changes, how we do skills training, universal income. It's a terrific book.
Congressman, nice to see you again. You know, you just talked about sort of your level of skepticism regarding the viability of impeachment, but in the wake of Senator Romney and also Senator Sass coming out, sort of teetering on that level of impeachment, what do you see as the chance of possibly 20 more senators, sort of a domino effect, maybe possibly? I'm asking you to be a fortune teller here for the Republican Party to galvanize and potentially execute.
Yeah, I've been running around saying there's no chance the Senate would convict. There's people smarter than I am who say don't be so sure that there may be a 5, 10, 15% chance that depending on the fact pattern, maybe you get there. I don't think it's much more than 5, 10% likely. And look, the dynamics here are clear, and you know, I too would love to see more people take the route that Senator Romney has taken. Easy for me to say. You know, the Republicans, my Republican colleagues, it's easy for me to shake my fist, and I do that on Twitter and that sort of thing. But you know, the reality is they're responding to the incentives that they have, right? And we are approaching primary season. And if you go up against this president as a Republican, which again, in a profile and courage, I would urge them to do, you go down. You know, Mark Sanford, who's currently running for president, opposed President Trump, and he lost his primary. And so I understand the incentives that are driving them where they go. It's not hard to understand, but it is discouraging. Anyway, you asked what the probability is. I think it's pretty small. But again, other people who are very smart that I listen to say, you know, if it does turn, it turns quickly. There's that great F. Scott Fitzgerald quote about how you went bankrupt, you know, very slowly at first and then all of a sudden. You know, there is a little bit of a herd mentality that would obtain in this kind of thing, but I wouldn't hold your breath.
I was wondering if you think the partisan nature of Washington today has contributed to our foreign policy, or if there are other more significant factors.
Yeah, that's a great question. Ever looking for points of optimism in this craziness. I will tell you that actually our foreign policy, I think, collectively, certainly inside the Congress, and even inside the executive, has been bipartisan. The one area in which you do see the Republican senators oppose the president is in the area of foreign policy. So they voted by and large, not by a veto-proof majority, but they voted to sanction Russia. They voted to shut off our aid to Saudi Arabia with respect to the war in Yemen. And so yes, actually in foreign policy, there you see strong bipartisan instincts. And I mean, the president, again, the president's a little hard to predict, but you know, let me make this point. There is not a Democratic president in history who would have called off a military raid on Iran with 20 minutes to go, and the president did that. And you know, I think that has also, let's not get into whether that was good or bad. I could not be more happy that we're not at war with Iran, and that has repercussions and red lines and everything else. But anyway, my point is that both in the executive and in the Congress, you don't necessarily see bright lines on our foreign policy. There's a deeply isolationist instinct in the Democratic Party. There's a lot of Democrats who say, oh my God, you know, our bridges are falling down here. Why in God's name are we building bridges in Afghanistan? So anyway, ever hoping for evidence of bipartisanship, I think foreign policy is one area where there actually is in Washington.
Someone.
Yeah, you're going to have to make sure that's turned on there.
Hello? I'll stick it in my mouth. Recently heard from young people all over the world about their concern, really fear about the climate emergency. What will it take for Washington to act? Part of this is, what is the impact of the climate emergency on national defense and security?
Yeah, I'm glad that came up because climate change is very much a foreign policy issue. We tend to think about it as a domestic issue, but it's very much a global and therefore a foreign policy issue. And apart from the damage that has been done to the U.S. as sort of a leader in arenas like NATO and stuff, I am devastated by our giving up of leadership on climate change. And not just because the problem is severe, but also because we're giving up huge technological opportunities associated with really leading on the climate change issue. And so at the very moment where we need to be selling advanced battery technology to the Chinese and the Indians, who account for whatever it is, 2+ billion people on the planet, at the very moment we need to be selling them the technology that we build here, we've lost all credibility because we're telling California that they can't set mileage standards anymore, withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement. So I think it's a huge tragedy, and again, not just because of the feel good we want to preserve the planet stuff, but because it's a massive lost economic opportunity. So again, I don't have the answer. Let me end with one point of some optimism. I've been doing this about 10 years, and 10 years ago we had open climate denial in the Congress. It was kind of a position for a lot of people. Today, people have come a long way. Today, the conversation is much more, I get it, it's a serious problem. How do we fix it without, and this is a very legitimate question, without devastating the coal states, without radically raising energy prices in Florida, where all electricity is made by burning stuff. So the conversation, not nearly fast enough, but the conversation in Washington has actually gotten a lot smarter. That's my point of optimism in an otherwise pretty ugly arena globally.
Good afternoon, Congressman. I wanted to draw attention to the Balkans, where we haven't had a lot to mind in the news in recent years, as many of the countries have been aspiring into Europe and many joining NATO and progressing in a direction that many of us here in the States hoped for. I was struck on my way here noticing that Kosovo actually has an election today, and the election seems to be going in favor of a younger batch of new leaders that seem to be aspiring in the same direction that we're on, and seemingly prevailing against the choices of Russia and Turkey and others that have strong influences in that part of the world. On the other hand, I was also struck last week that the White House appointed a new special envoy who has been speaking openly in Germany and other places about the willingness to open up topics like border movements and the like, which can obviously flare up into all kinds of improvisations and extremism, leading to a new proxy area for the interests of the United States, NATO, Russia, Turkey, and others to have a new conflagration. For those interested in continuing the progress in that part of the world, what would you say?
Great question. It's good to see you. In the interest of making sure we got good questions, 3 thoughts. Number one, what the U.S. did in the Balkans was, number one, an example of fairly enlightened intervention that I think was a good outcome. Unless you're a Serb, you believe it was a good outcome. I think the rest of the world thinks so. And it troubles me. Iraq hasn't come up, but post-Iraq, I'm not sure that we would do that. And I think we need to really grapple with the fact that Iraq has reduced the probability that we might actually use this incredible $800 billion a year military for good things like what the U.S. military helped achieve in the Balkans. So number one. Number two, it also really showed, in some sense, it was an early indicator of the failure is too strong a word, but let me just use it, the failure of the concept of Europe. The Europeans were like, the Americans are going to stay out, we're going to fix this. No, not even close, right? And that was an early indicator. Thirdly, I share your concern. In this context, I don't want to be gratuitously critical of the president, but if the Russians have an interest in it, I'm very worried about where the U.S. may go. You could imagine the president in some attempt to try to make, Putin return his phone call, does something in the Balkans that would be inconsistent with what our policy there has been.
Congressman Hans, first, thank you for your service. It must be difficult to deal with these issues, as things change so rapidly day to day. But what, if any, are our responsibilities to the protesters in Hong Kong?
It's a great question. At some level, I think the answer is both true and a little superficial, by which I mean we should support the democratic and the liberal aspirations of people wherever they are. And so were I president, I would probably be more vocally in support of their desire for what they were promised in the Hong Kong agreement. I would temper that with, there's no clear answer in anything foreign policy related. I would temper that by noting my serious concern about the use of violence by the protesters. Using violence is wrong in and of itself. It also invites a brutal Chinese intervention, which I don't think serves anybody's interest. So, again, that feels a little superficial to me, but I would be more vocal. And we have this conversation, this is a great room to talk about this. We have this conversation about Barack Obama's decision to support the protesters in Tahrir Square, which was a massive break in our traditional foreign policy. But I believe we should, if we stand for one thing, it is for the advancement of accountable government, democracy, and liberal, and we shouldn't be shy about saying that, but at the same time we should be smart and say, but when you start putting, steel bars through government offices, now you're going beyond the pale.
I just want to make a note that we are going to be taking questions until 4:30, so be patient and we'll get to as many as we can.
To get back to impeachment a little bit, considering You know, we're going to go through the impeachment process in the Senate, and eventually we'll have another election. Have you been giving any thought to, I mean, assuming that Congress, the new Congress after 2020, will want to do something about what happened now, in this term, have you given any thought to what the Congress might do to prevent this from happening again? And I'm thinking particularly in terms of the relationship between the president or the executive and Congress.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I have sort of a technical answer to that, which is inevitably we're going to need to take a bunch of things that were norms, that were just sort of understood. You know, you didn't attack NATO, publicly. If you wanted them to own up to their obligations, you did it privately. Or, you comply with congressional subpoenas. Things that were always norms, we're going to need to write down. And that's a little uncomfortable, right? I mean, every society, every government has some boundary between, unstated norms and laws and regulations. I mean, the Brits don't even have a written constitution, so they have a lot more norms than we do. Well, when you're in a period where a president has just blown through all kinds of norms, you're going to need to write a lot of this stuff down. And that's a little bit, okay, maybe that's good, but it's a little uncomfortable because the beauty of an unwritten down norm is that there's some flexibility in it. So that's the less interesting technical answer. But look, we are a republic. And I'm reminded of what Benjamin Franklin said after the Constitutional Convention when he was asked what kind of government had been crafted. And he said, a republic if you can keep it. And I hesitate to give the technical answer first because it's up to us collectively to decide how we're going to respond to this. And you might imagine, I'm pretty upset by people who are supporting the norm breaking and the behavior that I consider unconstitutional. So we have a project to convince the people who aren't upset about that they should be. So again, that to me is the important thing, right? We have a weird way of electing the president. So as it happened, more people voted for him not to be president than voted for him to be president. But be that as it may, we have a lot of work to do because if that illiberal instinct, we've been talking about illiberal populism, if that isn't addressed and fewer Americans don't feel pulled in that direction, we'll see this again. And what worries me, and the reason I have some passion around this, is that the forces that have created illiberal populism are not going away. In fact, if anything, they're accelerating in the sense that I think more and more people are going to find themselves struggling to stay in the middle class. Not necessarily because of trade or globalization, but because of automation, because of artificial intelligence. So I can come up with technical solutions on how we make, and yes, the Senate drives me crazy because the Senate is not representative and the Electoral College should change. I don't like the Electoral College. But the real answer is we've got to grapple with this as citizens, because if as citizens we don't stand up and say, this is what I expect of our leadership and our government, we'll be right back here again.
Mr. Congressman, thank you for coming out today to answer all of our many, many questions. I have a question about sort of the human side of it, of our foreign policy. It's all well and good to talk about sanctions and tariffs on governments, but what can we do to help the actual people in those countries?
You mean in those countries where we apply sanctions?
Like Hong Kong, Venezuela, China, the places where we know that things are happening to the populace that are bad.
Yeah, very different cases. Let's come back to Venezuela, because you actually have people starving and people not getting health care, and those who support the sanctions in Venezuela, as I do, have to own the fact that sanctions are a pretty blunt tool. Almost everywhere, sanctions tend to do more harm to people outside the regime than people inside the regime. I'm sure that Maduro and his cronies have well-stocked Swiss bank accounts, and they're not going hungry. But you can't dismiss that as a tool because it's worked most notably in South Africa when the South Africans finally cried uncle. And of course it worked in getting us the nuclear agreement with Iran. So again, like everything else in foreign policy, it's never black and white, it's never good evil. I would hope, and this is naive to say, but I would hope that we could prevail on the Venezuelan regime to allow aid to flow in, to allow food to flow in, which they have resisted at times. But there's no good, there's no, if you support sanctions as I do, you have to own the fact that it hits a lot of innocent people in some very ugly ways. Last thought, again, whether it's Venezuela or Iran or Hong Kong, we have to be clear about who we are and what our political values are. And this is another, I hate to sort of come back to the criticisms yet again, but this is another thing that we're giving up right now. When our president is cozy with Duterte, who killed 20,000 people in the name of narcotics control, or Putin, we are showing that we actually don't care about the kind of liberal democracy that I think we are the exemplar of. So, again, I think consistently we have to be clear about our values. I would tell the Saudis as we tell the Iranians that, look, we may ally with you as we have, but as long as you are a monarchy which does not allow for any political representation and abuses the rights of women, you'll never be our ally. You may never be our friend. You might sort of be an ally of convenience. I think we need to do more to remember that our strength at the end of the day is really not our military or our wealth. It is the fact that everybody wants to come here because of the values that we have in our political system.
If I could put in a plug, listening to this, because the question too, I think, is perhaps about development, and this goes, since I chaired USAID's board, I'm going to put that hat on for a moment. What's particularly troubling to me with what's happening now is at the same time we have some of the greatest need for robust humanitarian and development assistance. For example, what's causing the problems at our border, what's driving these desperate people who want to come to the United States, the fact that they're facing such troubles back in their own home. And these are countries that we can make a big difference in if we had a good, robust development assistance, and that unfortunately continues to be cut. I mean, we saw what we could do in Colombia with Plan Colombia made just an extraordinary difference when we were really focused on something. And what's happening now is sort of, at one point, screaming about all of these problems, but on the other hand, not really doing anything about the root of them.
Hi, Congressman. In regards to Iraq, there's been a lot of protests in the last week or so. Should we be involved? If we stay out, does that create a vacuum? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. One of the things we do as Americans, apart from sort of always wanting the right good answer and the belief that there is a right good answer, is that I think we underappreciate the power and the draw, what I was talking about with this young lady before, the power and the draw of the political system that we represent. I mean, Putin is barely sitting on, is sitting pretty uncomfortable on his throne right now. There's protests in Moscow, there's protests in Baghdad, there's protests in Cairo, there's protests in Poland. This is the optimist in me. I think the march towards a more responsive, more liberal world is not stoppable. That doesn't mean it's always going to be linear forward, right? We're seeing that right now. You can take a few steps back, no question. But we ought to be more secure in the notion that nobody, not even the Chinese, want to live in an authoritarian and liberal society. So again, we should be a little bit more confident about that fact, because if we were more confident about that fact, I think we would get ourselves into fewer military interventions. We would be more sophisticated in the way that we promote and support movements like this one. Do I think we should? In Iraq, do I think we should be doing more? I don't know quite what you mean by that, but we've sort of demonstrated that we don't have really the ability to alter Iraqi politics in ways that are comfortable for us. And let's also remember that, again, you've heard me be optimistic. Let's also remember that sometimes simply having our hand involved, except maybe in the realm of development, USAID, Peace Corps, if we come in a big way, we do some damage to the people who we are looking to support. Guaido, you know, we actually provided almost no support to Guaido, but what did Maduro say? He's a creature of the CIA, he's an American proxy, he's an American puppet, so we have to be careful about embracing people and how we do it, and confident about the fact that these instincts are not going away.
Thank you very much. There was a report yesterday in the New York Times that Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS, or known also as Mr. Bonesaw, has called Pakistan and Iraq for peace with Iran. What is the U.S. position, actually the Congress position? Are you going to help out to come up with peace in that region?
I saw that too. So in case you couldn't hear it, there was a report in the New York Times yesterday that indicated that MBS, the Crown Prince, the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, has sort of let it be known that he would like to negotiate with the Iranians. I think that's a spectacular thing. And I'm not surprised, maybe I am, but I'm not entirely surprised that he got there. Let me give you a little bit of background here. The Saudis were in an interesting box when the attack occurred on their oil facilities. In fact, we all were in an interesting box, right? Because what Yemen has demonstrated to the world, and in particular to the Iranians, and I see this up close and personal in certain rooms in DC, is the utter incapability of the Saudi military. It's just been a disaster. And by the way, part of the humanitarian crisis in Yemen is caused by that fact. You have pilots who are dropping bombs from 30,000 feet instead of 10,000 feet, so that has implications for collateral damage. Anyway, the Iranians observed and the world observed the Saudis have no military capability. By the way, 19 missiles and stuff, you know, hit their most sensitive economic asset. So they were in a box because you say to yourself, and look, they were attacked, so they do a proportionate response to Iran. Okay, that's legitimate, except they would have gotten crushed. Had they flown planes into Iranian airspace, those planes would have been taken down. So they're in a pretty ugly box, and this is after billions and billions of dollars of U.S. military aid and training go in there. And so with that as background, I could not be more delighted that they are trying to take down the temperature. And here I think we can get involved. I don't think this administration will. Mike Pompeo, president, I think they've just got a bizarrely near religious view of how bad Iran is. But if you could take down the temperature and start to get back to a place where we're talking to Iran, apart from dramatically reducing the probability of war, we could find ourselves back in a world where Iranian moderates are now getting a little bit of standing. Maybe there's somebody we can negotiate. Maybe we go back to a place that is like the old Iran deal. Maybe it's better than that. I don't know. Maybe the president can negotiate a better deal. I doubt it, but maybe. So anyway, that's a long-winded and rambling answer saying that I think that was a terrific thing. And I'm not surprised it happened because the Saudis didn't have the wherewithal to respond proportionately to the attack that was perpetrated on their petroleum infrastructure.
And there was also speculation, wasn't there, that MBS in large part is doing this because he saw Trump not responding and began to realize that maybe he can't rely on the United States as his proxy to take on Iran. And there was also, I'll do a follow-up since I had that one question, on what is the appropriate response to Iran. If they continue to behave this way and either attack Saudi or other allies, what is an appropriate response? For example, because you're very deeply involved in this, I know, cyber warfare, which we've used before in Iran, and apparently there were lots of plans on the books to do that in response to this latest attack. And I'm not sure we know whether or not some of those have actually occurred, but is that an appropriate response? When and where should we use something like cyber warfare in response to aggression?
There may have been, and I'm not being archer, I don't know the answer to this question, there may have been a cyber response to the downing of the U.S. drone. I would have supported the president taking a proportionate response to the drone attack. I don't think it's good for the Iranians to believe, as they do today, that neither the US nor the Saudis are going to push back militarily against their military action. So I would have probably supported, you know, sinking what did our drone cost? $120 million, you know, sinking hopefully without lethal results, sinking, you know, a boat or something, just to let the Iranians know that there will be a cost to military activity. That didn't happen, and so they found themselves in a pretty strong position. I think, you know, at the end of the day, they're playing a very weak hand pretty well. MBS is suing for peace. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure that, I mean, maybe a cyber attack would have been a proportionate response, but what I really hope, and it's not going to happen under this administration. Look, I voted for the Iran nuclear deal, not because it was a great deal, but because it was the best we had. And what I had hoped might have happened, and make no mistake, the Iranian regime, you know, the missile research, the messing around in Syria and Lebanon, and the, you know, arming of Hezbollah and Hamas, it's all awful. If you'd taken a different approach and said, let's use the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, as a starting point and continue to use the carrots and sticks to say, okay, now we want you to stop arming Hamas, right? Gaza's not your fight. We understand why Syria maybe, you know, or Iraq, you know, Iraq borders Iran, they fought a war. So if we could have, over time, through carrots and sticks, brought in their misbehavior, that, I think, would have been a better approach than where...
Well, you even got a little further, right? Because I think I read that you said that if we hadn't pulled out of JCPOA, the Iranians would not have attacked the Saudi oil. So, or you don't think they would?
Oh, absolutely not. No, I think when they realized that there was no real negotiation, you had the maximum pressure campaign with 12 demands that were basically capitulation. I think they realized, okay, there's no route there. Pompeo, Bolton was still in the White House at the time. They're not, and look, if you read the 12 demands, that wasn't a legitimate offer. So I think they realized we need to destabilize the region and make the world say, oh my God, we're going to have a war in the Persian Gulf with all of the impact that would be. And they correctly judged that the Saudis, the American president, who is not a dumb man and knows what another war in the Middle East means for his November 2020 prospects, I mean, I think they played the cards right. And they you know, took down our drone and attacked the Saudi facilities, and the world said, wait, step back, let's talk. I don't like them having that initiative, but it's probably a good outcome.
But, and by the way, I mean, has Jared's efforts pretty much gone by the wayside? We never saw the peace. We haven't talked about the Palestinian issue, which is interesting. But I mean, we haven't seen the peace plan. And initially, actually, I thought if they, you know, when you saw the alignment between Egypt, Saudi, Jordan, Israel, you know, which really comes from the Sunni-Shia split, there was a path, I thought, perhaps, in getting those countries together to basically force the Palestinians to a settlement. All that, and then we recognized Jerusalem and probably blew that up. But is there any hope to what has been going on for all these years on a peace plan?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, all due respect to Jared Kushner, you know, guys with generations more knowledge and understanding of the region have failed. No, I think, look, I think this administration has taken itself away from the negotiation table for the reasons that you've outlined. You know, the Palestinians have always looked at the United States as not really playing in good faith, that we, you know, all too often back the Israelis. And that's, I'm not saying that's right or wrong, I'm saying that's the way they look at us. Well, when Trump comes out and, you know, says, yeah, you ought to recognize the Golan Heights, we're going to move the embassy to Jerusalem, and, you know, it goes on and on and on. The Palestinians are like, this is, why would they engage there? And I'm not letting them off the hook. I mean, you know, the Palestinians, what's the old saying? You know, never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, but there really are no opportunities with this administration for, I think, in their minds. Yeah. No, it's a tragedy. I said this to a bunch of pro-Israel advocates. I'm as pessimistic as I've ever been on the ability for us to resurrect a two-state solution. And so anyway.
So this is our last question.
Congressman, I'd like to get your perspective with your knowledge gained by being on the Intelligence Committee. Do you view North Korea and Iran gaining nuclear capability as an existential threat to our country? And if so, where does it rank on your list of existential threats?
Yeah, great question. I grapple with the word existential. The literal definition of existential is you cease to exist. Someday could the North Koreans take out Seattle, and if they do that, whether is it existential? So let me answer the question slightly differently, which is I worry in this order. I worry about North Korea, Pakistan, and Iran in that order. Meaning, I worry less about Iran for two reasons. Number one, they don't have nuclear weapons today. And two, this may be naive, but I think Iran is deterrable. I don't think that about North Korea. And I don't ever want to be in a world where we need to test the deterrence against Iran. And that's why I supported the JCPOA. So again, maybe I'm being naive, but I do believe that they're probably deterrable. North Korea, not so much. So what I worry about in North Korea is the development of long-range delivery systems, which they are working on. And you just hope, and you make your policy objective to get them to stop developing those long-range delivery systems while you, hope against hope, try to give them a pathway to be a reasonable member of the community of nations. Something you also want to do with Iran. Pakistan is second on my list because you've got two characteristics there that make me very nervous. One is a bizarre, and by bizarre I don't mean ununderstandable, but a bizarre enmity with India that could lead to an exchange. And I'm not sure that a nuclear exchange, it's terrible to talk about it this way, I'm not sure it's not existential to the United States, but it's a global catastrophe. And you have an unstable government. Maybe unstable is too strong a word, but you gotta. We've seen military coups in Pakistan time and again, and it is not inconceivable that some of the less savory characters who hang out in places like Peshawar and the northwest frontier territories could make a run at the government. And that's sort of the sum of all our fears, right? I mean, if there is no real functioning government in Islamabad, and we're not quite sure who's got the nukes, that in some ways that I said they were second, but in some ways that may from time to time be my main worry.
Well,
oh, good. Let's end there.
Yeah, something else to keep us awake at night. Well, thank you. Our time is up, but thank you very much, Congressman. Thank all of you. Very knowledgeable group.